Geophysicist Stefan Burns here with more breaking news as it relates to this incredible earthquake swarm that's occurring right now in the Aegean Sea, right off the coast of Santorini Island, in the Christiana Santorini Colombo volcanic field, this region right there. Well, a few new updates for you. First and foremost, there has been a re-acceleration of this seismic swarm over the past 24 to 36 hours, and there have been some new high magnitude events. So we had a magnitude 5.2 and magnitude 5.1 that occurred in rapid succession less than 24 hours ago. They were connected with a new set of pre-earthquake signals that were observed out of Cumiana, Italy, just like this magnitude 5.2 was, and that occurred back on February 9th. So now we have pre-earthquake signals that we have observed on February 9th and also February 10th, indicative of some sort of electromagnetic disturbance occurring either underground or with the ionosphere, or both. We'll talk about those dynamics in detail in this video so you can understand that. And some evidence supportive of that is the fact that the British Geologic Survey has come out with some new evidence suggesting that there is fluid-driven swarm-type seismicity that's occurring in this region overall, and that could explain some of these unusual electromagnetic emissions, because if you have fluid underground and it's laden with salts and ions, charge carriers, and that's moving, that will generate disturbances to the electric field. So a lot to cover in today's video, and let's get right into it. Let's begin by examining the evidence that this seismic swarm that's occurring in the Aegean Sea is in part being driven by fluid dynamics of the subsurface. This evidence is being presented by the British Geologic Survey, and what they did is they took all the seismic data coming in, they applied a machine learning algorithm to it to identify these lower magnitude events, which typically would be harder to identify in a seismic swarm because their signals are lower in their amplitude than these higher magnitude events, which we see there in gray. So that's like the normal extent of this swarm that's being plotted and shown across a lot of different graphics. But all these red dots there are the lower magnitude earthquakes identified with this machine learning algorithm, and they contain a lot of useful information. And based on that information, it appears that there is some sort of fluid-driven mechanic that's at play. Let us read this quote right here. "We have evidence that this is fluid-driven swarm-type seismicity that comes in pulses. This is not unheard of in other volcanic regions. However, this time it is evolving on top of active faults that complicate the expression of seismicity. It is easy to get a disconnected story when we just look at moderate magnitude seismic events. It is only when we investigate the smaller magnitude events that occur between that we learn of the hidden mechanisms that take place between the large earthquakes. It is critical that we track whether those pulses become more frequent and how they migrate in space and depth. So far, the largest quake in this swarm has been a 5.2 magnitude. That is from Dr. Margarita Segu, and so there is evidence now that there are some other dynamics at play here related to the volcanism of the area. Of course, a lot of people have been talking about that, whereas others have been completely denying whether there is any volcanic component to this. Clearly, the two are connected together. Now, we also see some very interesting migrations of the epicenters of these earthquakes with this graphic here. You can actually see that on the first data graphic too. So they put a linear channel just in general plotted over these seismic events. You'll notice that there's this pulsing back and forth along this channel, and the movement of that is about 2 kilometers per hour. So back here on the 1st of February, it was a little bit more towards the southwest, and then things started to migrate towards the northeast and back and forth, and you'll notice that trend very, very clearly. So this is showing a more complex situation than originally believed, and that's just because we simply now have more data to look at, and this trend wasn't really showing itself in just the first 24, 48, 72 hours. Now it's been nearly 2 weeks. In fact, it'll be 2 weeks with the upcoming full moon. And before we look at those new pre-earthquake signals, I quickly want to point out just this most recent seismic activity right there. All those yellow dots correspond to the most recent events. You'll notice that they are right there at the most northeastern part of that linear channel. And in fact, this is right around the epicenter of that magnitude 7.8 earthquake that occurred on July 9th, 1956. there's a little bit of ambiguity as to where that epicenter is exactly. USGS has it plotted right around here, and then there are some research papers that have the epicenter plotted more to the south of Amorgos, right about there. So in general, it's right in this region, and we see that these earthquakes, as of right now, are starting to cluster right up against that historic epicenter for that magnitude 7.8 earthquake, which in fact is the strongest earthquake that has occurred in the entire GNC going back to the year 1900. There's not that many earthquakes that have occurred in the central of GNC. Most of them have occurred along the perimeter, but the strongest earthquake, that magnitude 7.8, occurred right here in this location, and that in general could represent a higher magnitude upper bound if there is to be a higher magnitude earthquake that ruptures as a result of this seismic swarm. And this is all foreshock activity. That is not guaranteed. There's a lot of discussion around that. This could just be a seismic swarm. It also could be a foreshock seismic swarm indicative of something bigger coming. And right now, a lot of people, if they are suggesting that there is a higher magnitude earthquake coming, they are suggesting that the highest magnitude it reach would be magnitude 6, magnitude 6.1, 6.2. Well, I would say if there's a historic magnitude 7.8 that just occurred in this region on geologic time, right, 1956, that is the true upper bound in terms of the magnitude. So anywhere from just what's happening right now, which is low magnitude 5s, going all the way up to a magnitude 7.8, I would say is within the realm of possibility. And we are now seeing pre-earthquake signals from these magnitude 5+ events, which is indicative of something coming our way. Let's check it out. Here we have vertical electric field data out of Cumiana, Italy, as collected by VLF.IT. You can go to their website, check this out yourself. They have a real-time observatory there. So this is data from February 9th, and we see some very unusual electromagnetic signals in the vertical electric field right here. This is going from 0 to 105 hertz, and then above it we have 0 to 1500 hertz, and this is our VLF field. That would be 0 to 15,000 hertz. And so these are highly unusual. If you watch this stuff, you know that this is very bizarre. You get these sort of signals often before earthquakes. There's a rich body of research on this out of Japan, out of Greece, out of California. A whole bunch of information that you can look into if you're interested in pre-earthquake signals. We'll go over some of that in today's video. But this is what occurred on February 9th. And if I zoom in right here, you'll notice the timing of this earthquake quadruple sequence. This is what I mentioned in yesterday's video. We see that magnitude 4.7, 5.2, 4.6, 4.7, all in less than 25 minutes. And we had these pre-earthquake signals right before, and then there were some tail signals afterwards, though the amplitudes went down. So that is what occurred on February 9th. And then February 10th, yesterday, we saw more of these potential pre-earthquake signals, very nicely correlated with magnitude 5+ earthquakes out of Greece. Let's check it out. Here we have our anomalous vertical electric field fluctuations. What we're measuring here is basically the electric field in a vertical direction, running from the ground surface to the ionosphere. And there is a direct current that flows from the ground to the ionosphere and back, depending on the charge, whether it's positive or negative. But you also have these fluctuations, alternating fluctuations on top of that. And these are fairly low in their intensity. This is like, for example, microvolt in strength or picotesla in strength if it's a magnetic field. So we're measuring here the vibrations upon that current within that vertical electric field. And we see that there's a variation across time of that frequency with this higher power signal. So this is indicating some sort of telluric current at depth that's then reaching up to the subsurface and then into the atmosphere, or it's representative of some sort of ionospheric disturbance. And typically those two are actually combined together. They kind of create one another. So we'll talk about that more. But you notice this parabola shape very clearly. That is another clear sign that this is potentially a pre-earthquake signal, because they typically will have this sort of frequency modulated parabola look to them. And you also notice that they're dipping down into this frequency range that is associated with pre-earthquake signals. And that would be from about 15 to 35 hertz. So mode 1 there at 8 hertz, 14 hertz, 20 hertz, right? This is right in that 20 to 30 hertz range. And then these are even in the higher frequency modes of the Schumann resonances. So another batch of pre-earthquake signals out of Cumiana, Italy, closely linked to these magnitude 5 earthquakes that have occurred in the seismic swarm out of Greece. And so now we have 2 in a row, back to back across 2 days of this connection. It'll be really interesting to see if this happens again tonight and whether we have some more high magnitude earthquakes in this swarm right around this magnitude 5 range, potentially, the big one, and more pre-earthquake signals. And we have that full moon coming up on the 12th. I've talked about that in depth, how there's increased tidal forces with new moons and full moons due to the alignment of the sun, earth, and moon. I'm not going to discuss that in this video, but that is a potential trigger mechanism at play on the 12th. So that is definitely a period of time to be watching this very closely. So based on that machine learning algorithm, the British Geologic Survey identified all those lower magnitude earthquakes. And from that data, they infer that there is potentially some sort of fluid-driven mechanism that's currently at play with this seismic swarm. And so let us learn more about telluric currents. These are Earth's electric currents. And there are dozens of ways to generate telluric currents. So we can't cover all of them, but we'll cover the most important as it relates to the seismic swarm. First and foremost, the piezoelectric effect. This is really, really cool if you're not aware of it. And actually you interact with it on a daily basis with your technology, though you're probably unaware of that. So mechanical stress on rocks and semiconductor minerals, materials, triggers the piezoelectric effect. What happens is that free electrons, because of that mechanical stress, they pop out of the crystal lattice structure that they're in, and because there's now a flow of free electrons, they generate an electric current. Conversely, if there is an applied electric field onto a piezoelectric material, that can induce mechanical stress within that material. That's known as the reverse piezoelectric effect. So this is very important as it relates to earthquakes, as you can imagine, because if you have building mechanical stress on a fault zone, this is then going to generate these telluric currents. And conversely, if you have changes to the electric field that are significant enough, that can induce mechanical stress in that fault zone. And if it's at a critical stress threshold, perhaps that's what causes it to finally rupture. That is a potential. Another way of generating telluric currents would be through the movement of charge carriers in groundwater. So as ionically charged fluids travel in porous rock, an electric current is created by the motion of those ions, because these are charge carriers. When they move, either it's a positive or a negative charge carrier, that will generate a change to the electric field and therefore an electric current. Now the scale of that electric current might not be that strong, it might just be millivolts, but that doesn't mean it's not significant at the molecular scale, or perhaps if you look at the cumulative view across a macroscopic view, for example, for an entire fault zone. So you have, for example, telluric currents created by these ionically charged fluids and their movement, right? Fluid-driven swarm seismicity. And as rock is displaced from seismic waves passing through it, the ion-laden groundwater in the pore space is also displaced. So right now we have this massive seismic swarm occurring right off the coast of Santorini in that volcanic field. And those fluid-driven mechanics may be because it is a volcanic field. And as there's this constant rumbling of the ground, that is also further displacing this ion-laden groundwater that's at depth existing in the pore space of these rocks. The motion of ions relative to the geomagnetic field creates circularly or elliptically polarized electric fields with opposite orientations for positive and negative ions. And so we also, if you're unaware, we have some mild geomagnetic activity that's occurring right now at this moment in time. There is something known as the KP index, a measure of geomagnetic volatility. This is how much Earth's magnetic field is undergoing swings in its field strength. And so that goes from 1 to 9, and 9 being the highest. We've been at a value of about 4 now for the past 48 hours. So in addition to the fact that all this seismic energy is causing these ions in the groundwater to start to pulsate and vibrate differently than they were before, that motion relative to the geomagnetic field generating these different electric fields, the geomagnetic field itself is also undergoing bigger swings at this moment in time due to some coronal hole space weather impacts. Let's talk about it. Now, in one of the earlier videos, I discussed the connection between solar activity and terrestrial events like earthquakes, whether that's correlation, whether it's causation. That is for more researchers to figure out. We're not going to go into that, but I am going to show you the sun over the past 48 hours. We see some very big coronal holes right now on the Earth facing side. They are enhancing the solar wind due to the high speed streams of charged particles that they emit, and that is causing this enhanced geomagnetic volatility at this moment in time. And so we have not only this coronal hole that's already swept by, we also have this big coronal hole here that is passing through the geoeffective position at this moment in time, enhancing the solar wind and also perhaps much more on this planet. And this enhanced solar wind is also altering the properties of the ionosphere at this moment in time because there is this connection between space weather, the magnetosphere, the plasmasphere, and the ionosphere. And if there's changes to the ionosphere, that induces changes to the subsurface because there is a capacitive type relationship between the ionosphere and Earth's ground surface because the ionosphere can induce geomagnetic currents in the subsurface, and we see a reciprocal effect going upwards as well. Some of the mechanical energy accumulated by the compression of rocks before large earthquakes is released upwards from the subsurface. These processes at the ground-to-air interface can lead to the injection of massive amounts of charged carriers, ions, into the lower atmosphere, greatly increasing air conductivity. Varied phenomena such as earthquake lights, rising temperatures, tropospheric pressure changes, ELF and VLF radio frequency distortions, and total electron content TEC perturbations in the ionosphere, like sudden ionospheric disturbances or traveling ionospheric disturbances, may occur as a result of the ion injection, finalizing the rock circuit. So what do I mean by finalizing the rock circuit? Well, you have in general this piezoelectric effect, and you have these naturally varying telluric currents down in the subsurface, some of them being driven, for example, by the motion of fluid-laden groundwater. Also, if you have powerful electric currents propagating in the ionosphere, that induces electric currents in the subsurface. So there's all those dynamics at play. Well, because of that, you have this kind of circuit dynamic that forms. But rock is generally fairly resistive, and you won't get a flow of energy unless the circuit is closed. And you could just create a very simple circuit with some wire and a battery to show that's true. Put an LED in there. Until you close that circuit, that LED won't light up, right? That's creating a pulsed light wave, right? It's emitting visible light at that nanometer frequency. Well, it's the same thing happening at the ground surface, but on a much different scale. You need the circuit to close for all of a sudden there to be that flow of energy. There's always some level of flow of energy, but for it to be accelerated, you could say, you need that circuit to close. And that means overcoming the resistance. If you can overcome that resistance, all of a sudden the circuit can flow and you can have this rapid flow of energy. And that seems to occur with earthquakes, specifically the higher magnitude earthquakes, though this has been observed with earthquakes of lower frequencies, for example, in the magnitude 5 range. They've observed that out of California, also out of Greece and Japan and a whole bunch of places around the world. So we have this dynamic occurring right now in Greece with the seismic swarm. We're seeing these anomalous ELF vertical electric field signals out of Cumiana, Italy, just nearby. That could be the result of a sudden ionospheric disturbance or a traveling ionospheric disturbance. It also could be indicative of the fact that there is a rock circuit underground in the Aegean Sea that is starting to really get connected together, enhancing the flow of energy that's then creating these ionospheric disturbances. And that's not being aided in any way by the fact that we have this enhanced geomagnetic activity right now because of the increased solar wind. And as I've discussed in prior videos, we have the full moon coming up tomorrow on February 12th. So right now the tidal forces are increasingly getting stronger up towards that event, because when you have the sun and the moon in alignment, whether it's a new moon or a full moon, you have the strongest tidal forces, meaning the strongest oceanic tides, the strongest earth tides, actual vertical displacement of mass and material, whether it's the ocean water, right? Or whether it's the actual solid earth. That creates more stress, has the potential to turn small fractures into larger fractures, allowing for larger ruptures along a fault. We've already had, obviously, a massive amount of fracturing occur as a result of this seismic swarm. Thousands and thousands of earthquakes have been recorded as a result of this, and we have that tidal trigger coming up. It may not result in anything, but in terms of the possibility of there being perhaps either just in general more seismicity or a higher magnitude earthquake event that is increasing over the next 24 to 48 hours as a result of that full moon. We're seeing these pre-earthquake electromagnetic signals. So there's a lot that's happening right now. And I would just advise you, if you're in the area, to be cautious, to be calm, and to be prepared. Again, I've been your host, Stefan Burns. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like the video, smash that like button. Subscribe to stay in the know, both on YouTube, and I also post updates in between to my Twitter X account at Stefan Burns Geo, so you can find some new information there as well. I'm going to be keeping a close eye on all this as I have been. I hope you found all this information useful, and I'll see you all very soon.